people, don't be losers and get bounced from the first round of your fantasy football playoffs. I'm Matty Kiwoom, and I'm here to help you get through the Week 15 schedule with 3 booms and 3 dooms. Let's get some wins in the first week of the fantasy football playoffs, baby. The first player that I'm going to talk about is Rico Dowdle. Over his last 3 games, he has gotten the lion's share of playing time at running back for the Dallas Cowboys. He's gotten 60% or more of the snap shares in those 3 games. He's had 120.7 total yards from scrimmage in each of those contests and has averaged 15.7 fantasy points. In week 15, the Cowboys will take on the Panthers. Now, the Panthers, they give up more than 150 rushing yards per game to their opponents, and they give up the second most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Matter of fact, Dallas is the worst. But we're talking about Rico Dowdle, folks. Rico Dowdle's been good for them boys as of late, and because of this cupcake matchup in week 15, Uncle Rico gets a boo. The next player that I'm going to talk about is Davante Adams. Now, after his injury, he started a bit slow for the Jets, but since week 9, he's averaged 17.6 fantasy points per game, and that's highlighted by a 26-point outburst against the Dolphins last week. And in 4 of his last 5 contests, Adam has seen double-digit targets. We knew Rodgers would target a guy like Davante, someone he's familiar with, in the red area, and so far that dynamic duo has not disappointed. Adams is seeing a ton of looks inside the 20 for the Jets. And in the first round of the fantasy football playoffs, the Jets face off against the Jaguars. Now, the Jaguars have one of the softest matchups for opposing wide receivers. That zone defense has been exploited time and time again this season. Tay Adams is still good. The vibes are high between him and his quarterback. I mean, despite the Jets being an absolute dumpster fire, but we don't care about that. We care about fantasy production, and Davante Adams has been good as of late, and that is why the veteran is getting a big boom for week 15. Let's talk about Brock Bowers. He is having a record-breaking rookie season for the Raiders. 118 targets for the tight end, 87 receptions. He's averaging about 16 fantasy points per game. And when you look at the warp chart that you can find on southharmonff.com, I highly recommend that you do. You'll notice he has the highest warp, which means he is the most valuable tight end in fantasy football this season. In the first round of the fantasy football playoffs, Brock Bowers will square off against the Atlanta Falcons. Now, all season, they've been a very advantageous matchup for any pass catchers that they go up against. And when you think back, let's think our minds here, way back, and get in the way back machine, all the way back to week 14. That secondary was absolutely destroyed by the pass catchers on the Minnesota Vikings. And when you look at tight ends specifically, the Falcons are the 11th most advantageous matchup for tight ends. It hasn't been good all season for the Atlanta secondary. It's not going to get better for the first round of the fantasy playoffs, which is a good thing if you roster Brock Bowers. Now, Bowers brings a bit of excitement to a position that, well, really doesn't have much excitement. And that is exactly why Mr. Bowers will bounce back in week 15. And I'm going to give him not 1, not 2, but 3 booms. Let's talk about Baker Mayfield. Mayfield's been really good so far this season. He's actually been a top 5 quarterback on a points per game basis, but when you look at his weekly production, you'll notice something. He hasn't finished inside the top 5 in a given week since Chris Godwin went down with an injury against the Ravens on Monday Night Football. He's had 3 finishes outside the top 15 over Tampa Bay's last 5 games, and over the last 2 games, he's had 4 interceptions. He hasn't been as dialed in over the last couple weeks as he was previous to the Godwin injury. In the first round of the fantasy football playoffs, Baker Mayfield will take on the Los Angeles Chargers. The Chargers defense has 13 INTs so far this year. They're actually a bottom tier defense for opposing quarterbacks in fantasy football. They're a really, really tough matchup. And last week on Sunday Night Football, they did hold Patrick Mahomes under 20 fantasy points. They'll get a home game against Mayfield. Not a good matchup when we're looking at the first round of the fantasy football playoffs. Now, personally, I love Baker. Who doesn't? I'm happy he's been good this year. It's awesome to see him live up to what we thought he'd be coming out of college. But for week 15 specifically, I got to give my guy a doom. Next, I'd like to talk about Jonathan Taylor. JT has flashed this year, no doubt about it, but he's hardly a top 20 running back in points per game. And when you look at the underlying metrics, they're not all that encouraging. He's got a bad juke rate. He's been pretty bad on a per touch basis. He hasn't had a game over 20 fantasy points all the way back to week 3. That offense has been up and down all year, and it's really affected Jonathan Taylor in fantasy football. As a matter of fact, 3 of the last 5 games for the Colts, Taylor has finished under 10 fantasy points. This week, the Indianapolis Colts and Jonathan Taylor will head over to Mile High Stadium to take on the Denver Broncos. The Broncos have been a good defense all season long, and they've been especially tough against opposing running backs. They give up some of the least amount of fantasy points per game to the position in 2024. And of course, the altitude, both teams coming off a bye, so there's not really an advantage either way. All these things are lining up in a poor fashion for Jonathan Taylor. As all of us fantasy managers know, we'll always have 2021 special season of Jonathan Taylor. But for week 15, the first week of the fantasy football playoffs, I hate to say it, but I got to give Jonathan Taylor a doom. It's going to pain me to talk negatively about this player, but guys, let's talk about Zay Flowers. My man Flowers has been in a bit of a skid over the Ravens' last 4 games. He's finished as wide receiver 47, wide receiver 35, wide receiver 32, and before the bye week, he finished as wide receiver 42. Now, in those 4 games, his catch rate has been awful. He's only caught 42.4% of his targets. And this week, in the first round of the fantasy football playoffs, the Ravens will take on the New York Giants. And you might be saying to yourself, the Giants, they suck. Well, surprisingly, they've been a really tough matchup for opposing wide receivers. They're actually in the bottom 4 in terms of fantasy points allowed per game. I know it's surprising, but the Giants have been tough against opposing wide receivers. Now, a factor that leads into that is, of course, their awful run defense. If they're bad at stopping the run, but they're good at stopping the pass, what we see there, folks, is a run funnel. We're going to see a lot of the game be facilitated through the king, Derrick Henry, and the legs of Lamar Jackson. I said it once, I'll say it again, it pains me. It really does, it hurts my heart. I really don't want to talk bad about Zay Flowers. I'm a huge fan of Zay Day, but for this week, I got to give my guy a doom. Gang, we are in the first round of the fantasy football playoffs. My 3 booms are Rico Dowdle, Davante Adams, and Brock Bowers. And my 3 dooms are Baker Mayfield, Jonathan Taylor, and Zay Flowers. I'm Matty Kiwu. Make sure you check out SouthHarmonFF.com. Subscribe to the South Harmon YouTube channel. Like this video, leave a comment. And folks, let's get those wins in the first round of the fantasy football playoffs. Peace.